Folks, we'll get started in just a few seconds. Let people file in. Hello, and welcome to the Chronicle of Higher Education's panel on improving research operations, which in my mind I've come to informally call the pandemic stinks, but here are some really cool innovations that smart, unflappable folks have taken away from it. I'm Alexander Kafka, a senior editor with the Chronicle, and I have with me today 4 inspired and inspiring panelists. First, though, a few housekeeping notes. Please send us your questions or comments in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I plan to include as many as I can in the second half of the event. Among those comments, I'd like to ask you please to share in that Q&A box any research innovations that you have found helpful during the pandemic. They could be high or low tech, expensive or free, something brand new or something old that you have found a new use for. Anything that helps you do, expedite, or communicate your research. And in that space, please explain briefly what it is, what it does, and how you found it. Also, a reminder, this discussion is being recorded. We'll send an email with a link to the on-demand version in a few business days. That email will also include links to some Chronicle reports and other resources that are shared during today's conversation. Our thanks go out to the underwriter of today's webcast, Microsoft. Midway through today's session, the panelists and I will switch off our cameras and sound while my colleague Liz McMillan speaks to Bill Campman, Director of Academic Medical Centers for U.S. Education Cloud Strategy at Microsoft. Let me introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. Derek Coburn is professor and director of COTELCO, the Collaboration Laboratory at American University. Julia Kubinek is vice president for interdisciplinary research at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Ray Panettiere is director of the Rutgers Institute for Translational Medicine. And Tom Scheinfeld is director of Greenhouse Studios and an associate professor of digital humanities at the University of Connecticut. Those brief titles and affiliations don't begin to tell you how incredibly accomplished these folks are, and I hope you'll read up on them if you haven't already. Derek, if it's okay, let me please start with you. Because what we're all doing right now, meeting virtually as a matter of routine, is something we've come to take for granted over the last year and a half. But you were a couple decades ahead of the rest of us. In 1998, you were already orchestrating a seminar between 6 universities, 3 in the US and 3 in South Africa. And as a clearly future-minded fellow, I wonder what you think is next on the web collaboration horizon, or maybe what's already here that we're just not making sufficient use of.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I'm really happy to be here and happy to join my colleagues. I think this is a fascinating conversation that we're about to have. The topic is so relevant, and you're right. In many ways, I do feel like I was ahead of my time, and people that are ahead of their time sometimes bear the scars to go with that. Pushing the envelope on some of these distributed collaboration tools and projects was difficult at times. There's no question about it. When we started this initiative back in 1998, it was supported by the Kellogg Foundation, and it was at the University of Michigan. And we really had the idea that distributed collaboration was something that scientists and scholars and people in the private sector in various industries were going to have to become more comfortable with. And we wanted students to be able to have the opportunity to learn how to work in a distributed environment. And so we created this global graduate seminar on information and communication technologies and development. And we divided the students from these 6 universities into teams, and they worked across distances with me as a faculty member moving from university to university. We ended up teaching that course over 12 years, with eventually moving to what we experienced over the last year, which was a completely virtual learning experience where I was no longer moving around and the students were no longer gathering together. So coming out of that experience, we thought this is, the National Science Foundation promoted this idea of cyber learning that went along with the focus on cyber infrastructure, where scientists would work in this way, and we would start to consider this to be infrastructure, that everybody would be able to work in this way and to teach and to have meetings in this way. But after that, when we had this experience, we thought this is the way to go, and we thought more people would be moving in this direction. But it was really like pulling teeth. We would talk about that you could have a class this way, and that you could have meetings effectively this way, and you could support research teams this way. And we got so much pushback from people that say, no, you can't do this. I can't teach a lab this way, or I can't have my meeting effectively this way. I can't, do what I need to do. And, we just bore lots and lots of scars of trying to promote these ideas. And then the pandemic hit and everybody had to move in this direction. And there was like an aha moment for so many people who said, oh, this is what you were talking about. You can do this. You can have an effective meeting. You can, build and design a research protocol. You can, have deep discussions and share tools and technologies. So I really believe that if we take advantage of this period effectively, we will learn from what we've done and not try to return to the way it was, but we really do think about how can we continue to harness these benefits that have come from being able to work so frequently and so tightly coupled with people that are not physically in the same location with us.
We're going to come back to some of those themes, but let me move over to you, Julia, for a second. Traditionally in the sciences, if researchers weren't primarily at the lab bench, they weren't thought to be getting anything done. Has the pandemic changed that perception of what a life in science should look like, where a scientist should be, and what she or he should be doing with their time?
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. When I was in grad school, that was exactly the perspective, that the productive time was the time that we spent in the lab, and the time that we spent at a computer or talking to each other was something you did superfluous around the edges. That has really changed, and the pandemic helped us realize how much of our time can be spent elsewhere. But also, it made us realize how essential the lab is for certain tasks, and how much we lost in the early stages of the pandemic when the students and the researchers were not able to get into the lab. I'm interested in hearing from Derek's experience about meetings. I've also found great effectiveness in the last year and a half having the meetings where there are between 5 and 20 of us individually in our different locations, and I find those very effective. But I have suffered some loss of intellectual stimulation in the small group to small group dynamic. So I'm looking forward to that moment when we've got the holograms with a giant screen on the wall, where the entire meeting of one side of the ocean is sitting around a table, and then the people on the other side of the ocean are at a different table, and we're looking at each other on this massive screen. I think that's something where I still feel we have a lot of struggles. So from the point of view of the scientists and the engineers who depend on lab research, the pandemic was actually very, very painful, because we treat our lab as the home, not just to do the experiments, but the home for the intellectual stimulation, to get each other motivated, and also to solve problems with each other. And we've had to find other solutions to that. My students have created a texting tree where for a while they were allowed to be back in the lab, but only 2 of them at a time. And since they used to get help from many more than just the one other person in the room at that moment, they would create these mechanisms to get help from each other. And they kept up with each other much, much better than I kept up with them. And I was grateful for that, because they managed to come out of that initial phase where we were completely unproductive, other than working on papers that were needed to be worked on in the background. But eventually they were able to get back into the lab and get going again, and to get that support they needed.
Thank you. Tom, one of the first things to go when the pandemic hit was travel, including research travel. You and your colleagues were already mulling a work share app for researchers, and the pandemic both underlined the need for that and made the project a little trickier, if I understand. Could you tell us how the idea of Sorcery came about and where it's at?
Sure. We at Greenhouse Studios at the University of Connecticut, we're just about to launch Sorcery. It's an application for sharing archival documents online. It borrows from some of the methods of the sharing economy, of apps like Instacart or DoorDash, applications that engage third parties with access to certain resources, with others who need access to those resources. So what Sorcery does is, or at least the original idea behind Sorcery was that I'm a graduate student working on my dissertation. I need access to, let's say, a primary source that exists in the British Library that hasn't been digitized yet. I need access to that for my work. How do I go about getting that? Well, one option would be to contact a librarian at the British Library, and various libraries will go and scan something for you. Others won't. Others do it for a fee. Others, some take a matter of days. Some take a matter of weeks getting those resources to the people who request them. Or another idea would be to somehow get in touch with another graduate student who's sitting in the British Library, who could request that source, take a picture of it, and send it to me directly. The problem is how to find that other graduate student that's sitting in the library. And Sorcery is intended to be that link, just as Instacart can connect you with someone who has the time and resources and inclination to go grocery shopping if you can't. Sorcery connects you with someone in place who has the time and resources and inclination to find a primary source document. So that was the idea behind Sorcery. We were about to launch just as the pandemic took hold and archives across the world closed to researchers. And so we spent the last year or more refactoring the application for use by archivists themselves, the people who do still have access to those archival resources, and we'll be opening up to the third-party service in the coming months. One thing to recognize, I think, a connection here to the sciences is one of the things, I'm sure, Julia, that allowed scientific researchers to continue to be productive during this time was just the vast array of digitized source documents, journal articles, and data sets, and other things that are available now. And that's just the last 20 years have just seen the tremendous growth of those kinds of resources. And I think what Sorcery recognizes, though, is that as much as has been digitized, we're still only talking about maybe less than 10% of the total amount of material produced by human hands and brains over the millennia. Most documents are still sitting on paper somewhere in an archive, a library, a courthouse, wherever it may be, even in a scientific laboratory. And so Sorcery is aimed at providing access to those things that haven't been digitized, but could be put to use at a distance.
Thanks, Tom. We're going to come back and explore some of the business and other details later in the panel. But let me turn to Ray now. Ray, the one kind of research that clearly needed to go full throttle when the pandemic hit was COVID research. But in a lockdown, clinical trials became complicated. Your team at Rutgers had ideas about how to carry out clinical trials in a decentralized way. Could you tell us how that's been working out?
Yeah, so Alex, thanks. Need was clearly the mother of invention. In early January in New Jersey, we were experiencing the consequences of massive pandemic. And we had to shut down. our clinical research operations to prevent people from getting infected and healthcare workers. But at the same time, we needed to completely pivot in a direction of COVID-19 studies, not only for the acute disease, but how are you going to do vaccinations? Now, at the same time, many tools were coming up but hadn't been implemented, such as electronic institutional review board, IRBs, and ECRFs, electronic case report forms. Those all came together around the pandemic, and the IRB committees, the committees who need to assess human studies, recognized they couldn't go the same old way. They needed to harmonize, they needed to streamline. They had to go from a 2-month review process to 4 days. And that was all done virtually. It was an absolute pivot in doing clinical trials that at that point we recognized we could do it. We had the aha moment that we could do it. And then we recognized, do we really need bricks and mortar clinical research units to do the studies? Think about it. If you're a patient who wants, or a participant who wants to get in a clinical trial, you have to stop work. It has to be convenient. You have to come to the site. You have to be intaked. You travel back and forth. How many obstacles could we put in the way of doing good science? Well, lo and behold, with personal monitoring, electronic CRFs and IRBs, we brought clinical trials to the home. Matter of fact, we were doing them in the region of central and northern New Jersey. Our studies now, in collaboration with third parties, we go across to Mississippi and then even further west, with us as the principal investigator, but engaging companies that can go to the home. Couple things that are magnificent out of this is we're bringing clinical research and trials to underserved neighborhoods and individuals who now can embrace clinical research and get the benefits out of that. So there's been very few benefits of a pandemic, but what we have seen is, I hate to coin the word, warp speed in changing the architecture of doing clinical trials. That's going to get the right medicine to the right patient faster.
Thank you so much, Ray. We're going to come back and I'm going to ask you about the 3 projects you've been working on. But Julia, let me go back to you on that theme of decentralization. Let's turn to the deceptively complicated issue of shared, accurate, durable research notes. They have to be more than just a shared doc or spreadsheet. They need to be versatile. For an effective shared notes environment, what capabilities does the note technology require?
Yeah, I think when we consider the variety of activities that go on with laboratory-based research, we have to think about the way the researcher is conducting the experiment. And typically they're working in a series of rooms with other people where they're moving between multiple essential instrument items that are each creating new data that they want to record. Those instrument items are supported by software that may not be compatible with the other instruments in the room. The software may exist only on the computer that's attached to that one microscope or that one chromatograph or that one balance or centrifuge. In addition, the scientists themselves use their powers of observation, their eyes, their ears, their noses, to make recordings in real time of what they're observing as they conduct the experiment. This enables the research to be reproducible later. So it's an essential aspect of scientific rigor to make accurate notes in real time. It's not always possible to do this on a single electronic platform at once, or at least it has not been until recently. And so you may not be surprised to hear that in very many labs around the world, including in my own lab and other labs in the US in science and engineering, students rely on a paper notebook as the fundamental item. In fact, in my lab, if fire was to break out, once we assess each other's safety, if we decided we had to leave, the first thing we would grab would be that notebook, the paper notebook. We would grab that probably before we would grab the valuable pieces of equipment because they can be replaced, but the notebook cannot. So it's always been the case that the notebook was a risky affair because it can be destroyed in a fire. It can be lost. It can be stolen. It can only be shared when the individuals are in physical contact to share it. And so we keep all the lab notebooks for my group in a bookshelf in one room where everybody can get at them, but they stay at the lab. So the first thing we did when the pandemic took hold and we sent the students home and said, why don't you work on some data analysis and publications during the next month or two? We said, well, I guess now you're going to be able to take the notebook with you. We never really allowed that in the past. So they took the notebooks with them, but then they couldn't share them. So industry has had this issue to solve for a long time and has developed and worked with companies that have electronic archiving for lab research. And it's not just a question of working with a spreadsheet. It needs to be a platform that is secure, that people log in using an authentication system that is tied to them. It has to date stamp and hour stamp in real time and prevent us from going back and correcting the record in retrospect. We can always add to the record, but we shouldn't be correcting the record. A correction should be an addition rather than an overwrite. There are multiple such products available, and my university at Georgia Tech, we bought a subscription finally to such a product this year. But this is something that industry, that companies have sought to solve for a long time because they need to protect those records for additional reasons that are important to them and to many of us that include IP, intellectual property. So the new innovations in lab notebooks and lab archiving that are electronic allow a user to copy and upload any kind of data from any number of platforms and add their own personal notations, take photos, upload photos, draw pictures. That's something we do when we're trying to show what the procedure is we're working on, and to be able to mix and match all those different kinds of evidence that make up rigorous scientific data.
And for your aquatic research, which is your background, I guess there are all kinds of other software and engineering challenges to come, because one thing notes need to be in your profession is waterproof. So it'd be nice if they didn't short out or corrode when wet too.
Yeah, we rarely want to take a laptop computer onto a small motorboat where we're going to be loading scuba diving equipment and buckets full of marine organisms to do analyses later. So there is actually waterproof paper. You can write on it with a pencil, and we take those pieces of paper back to the lab and transcribe them, and they make up part of the record as well. So field research is another area where I think we are in great need and are starting to see innovations in archiving data.
Thank you, Julia. We're going to turn now to our sponsor interview. Before we do, I just want to remind you, if you haven't already, to go into the Q&A box and tell us about your own innovations. We'll turn now for a few minutes to my colleague Liz McMillan and Microsoft's Bill Campman. The panelists and I will switch off our sound and video and rejoin you soon. Take it away, Liz.
Hey there. I am delighted to be here, and my camera is malfunctioning. Gosh, well, Bill, welcome to this interview. I'm not going to start my computer over and try to get the camera back on. We're just going to have to wing it here. Bill is the Director of Academic Medical Centers with Microsoft, and before Microsoft, he was an IT leader at 2 community colleges in Florida. Thank you for being here, Bill.
Thank you for having me.
It's really interesting to hear about some of the experiences the panelists have had about rethinking productive time, the new sharing apps that are being developed, relocating clinical trials, some of the positive things, and of course, some of the challenges. From your perspective, what are some of the most important changes that have emerged to the practice of research?
Yeah, it's been really interesting over the last year and a half. We've seen a large acceleration to get to cloud resources from a Microsoft perspective, and use virtual tools such as Teams and our Teams platform for collaboration across many different organizations. And that's both within the organization and across organizations. We're seeing that collaboration happen, and it's been somewhat of a challenge for some, but it's helped streamline those processes and build out that cloud security foundation that everybody needs. Make sure that we have all those government requirements in place and be able to build out those platforms for acceleration.
So when we talked last, you had some really interesting examples that you had seen of some institutions that had made some interesting innovations. Do you want to talk about that now?
Absolutely. With COVID and the pandemic creating such a stress on the healthcare system, there were many different opportunities last spring. One around ventilators, and everybody can remember the stories around ventilator shortages and being fearful of that. And we had an institution come forward to us, Duke University, where they had their engineering department had developed a splitter for ventilators for patients, and they needed to run a series of calculations to be able to have a clinician match patients on the ventilator. And it was a pretty big requirement of about 800,000 core hours. And they needed to get this done pretty quickly, actually over a weekend. And the institution, doesn't have exactly that kind of compute power laying around. But fortunately, we were able to meet that demand with the customer. And we were able to do that in about 15 hours, run that 800 core hour experiment for Duke University. And they were able to get their FDA approval on Monday.
That's actually a pretty amazing story. You also talked about some of the security issues that are associated with being in the cloud, and how it actually is allowing people to do things that they couldn't do necessarily before the pandemic.
Absolutely. One of the things that the public cloud vendors, Microsoft, I believe, is the leader here. Of course, I'm a little biased. We take security very seriously, and we have done a really good job securing our assets, our physical assets in the data centers across the world, as well as the tools within the data center to help meet HIPAA high trust requirements, to be able to meet NIST and FedRAMP requirements for government security, where many of the institutions are getting funding from. And we're seeing an explosion of funding come from NIH for COVID research, for example. And so we're able to align with those resources really well.
Great. And so we're coming up to almost 2 years of this period of pandemic. And I'm curious what you're seeing sort of farther down the line. What might be emerging out of this moment? What might be some permanent changes that you think will be happening to the practice of research?
Absolutely. So Julia had mentioned the ubiquitous hologram experience, and we're seeing that actually come to life. There's actually a story of 2 physicians in Mount Sinai Hospital that are using the HoloLens and able to help do remote assist surgeries around the world. So they were actually able to help a child in Uganda, help 2 surgeons with a procedure and a child in Uganda, and be successful at helping that surgeon through that process. And we're going to see more and more of that. I think, even through remote lab work, maybe not the smell and the touch, but actually the seeing, will be able to project with things like augmented and virtual reality. Right.
That sounds like an incredible accomplishment as well. And speaking of seeing and touching, I apologize to the audience and to you. I have serious computer malfunction, but I'm very grateful that you were here to tell us about your experiences. Thank you so much for being here, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you. Back to Alex.
Thank you both. At least your sound was working, Liz. So
at least my sound was working.
That's the flip side of innovation. You have to stay versatile and nimble, right? So in the $79 billion university research environment, money is always a factor. Tom, you and I have talked about your business model for Sorcery a little bit, and you explained that it is not your personal get-rich-quick scheme. So how does it work from a business standpoint, and how much will it cost users? You there, Tom?
Yeah, sorry, I had my mute on. Yeah, so we have sort of a dual business model for Sorcery, and important to note that Sorcery is it's a not-for-profit open source software product. built by the University of Connecticut. All IP is owned by the University of Connecticut, and the financial transactions are managed and supported by the Corporation for Digital Scholarship, which is a not-for-profit organization as well. But basically, there's two business models for sustaining this project. The first one is working directly with libraries and archives, a subscription model where libraries and archives can pay an annual subscription fee to use the service to fill requests that come into them from the field. It's free for most institutions. The very largest would pay a tiered pricing for that. And then there's the other business model is the third party business model where a researcher places a request for a document. That request is picked up by another researcher in place at the archive where the document resides. That researcher scans the document, sends it back to the original requester. The original requester pays a fee to the person who scanned the document, and we take a percentage fee of that cost to maintain the project. So those are the two business models.
Yeah,
Where
and the idea, Tom, is for the revenue to be enough that it's a self-sufficient, self-operating concern, right?
Yeah, our aim is to, yes. So most of the initial startup funding has been provided by grant funding, particularly a major contribution by the Mellon Foundation. But ultimately, we don't want to rely on grant money. So we want to build a revenue model that sustains the software and the upkeep and the servers and everything else, but does no more than that, and allows us to maintain our sort of open source values and mission.
Right. And Tom, what kind of issues have you had to tread carefully about in terms of just being considerate to the archives you want to work with? That is, what were the archives worried about, and how have you tried to reassure them?
Sure. I mean, this is an intervention in the workflows and traditional practices of archivists that have been established over many dozens, if not hundreds of years. We are trying to provide services at a distance, at a scale that archivists haven't in the past either been able to provide or thought was part of the possible mission of their institutions. And so we're working very, very closely with the archives community. We're doing workshops and outreach events, lots of listening to concerns about, is the availability of an application like this, which can send requests for documents from all over the world to a single archive, is it going to create a burdensome or overburdensome workload for the already stretched staffs and budgets of libraries and archives? Are sort of use policies, donor restrictions, copyright concerns going to be respected within the application? How are all those legalities handled through terms of service and other user agreements? So we're doing an awful lot of work, and in fact, a lot of our funding has gone to the actual building of the software, the writing of the code, but just as much of it, if not more of it, has gone to this kind of soft work of making sure that no one is exploited, no one is unduly burdened, that we respect the processes and restrictions and guidelines of the various professions, the research professions, the archival professions that we work with. And I'm sure that's true with, for instance, some of the applications and systems that, like Ray was talking about, that as much as they are technical systems, they are social systems where where the social practices and values and legal requirements and all of those things need to be well established. As much as these things are technical challenges, they are social challenges that we have to meet during this pandemic, especially.
Yeah, I had a picture in my head of, hundreds of screaming graduate students attacking the reference desk at the British Library all at once. So I can see why they might be worried. Ray, while we're on the theme of money, what about the costs of your decentralized clinical trials? Are they more expensive than the traditional model?
Well, it's a great question. We're just examining the economic model. Of course, we knew this was feasible, but what we're finding is a dramatic decrease in the cost of performing decentralized clinical trials. Think about this. You may need 3 or 4 coordinators spread over several shifts over several weeks to recruit patients. You now could use 1 or 2 in front of a Zoom call, interviewing the participant, acquiring the data. It's much more cost efficient. We can also do these visits according to what the participant wants. So we could do it at 10 p.m. if they're on different shifts, and we could capture the data because there's no travel. There's no reason to have security opening doors. So the nimbleness of doing the clinical trial, the ability to do this without a lot of travel and a lot of incurring overhead costs for rooms, I see this as being economically really advantageous.
There are 3 different trials, Ray, that you've used this approach for. Can you quickly walk us through the thrust of those projects?
Yeah, so those who may not be familiar with clinical trials, number 1, number 2, and number 3, most important, beyond getting the regulatory part accomplished, is finding participants for studies. So how do you do that? Well, in central Jersey, where I'm based in New Brunswick, I would go to my area and I would advertise and reach out and search my electronic medical records for patients. But that only captures maybe a denominator of 300,000 or 400,000. What I can nimbly do in decentralized studies, partnering with other firms, is take that and in concentric rings, as I'm trying to recruit, find this ring didn't recruit, so now we're going to go out another 300 miles and capture the next ring, and then the next ring, using social media as our hook for finding people with interest in clinical trials. Now you're soliciting them, but you're doing it in a knowledgeable way, given the use and the access of how people will use social media. So we still advertise, we advertise on social media, but we could also even do more refinements in targeting individuals who, may be in and out of diabetes sites that would have an interest, either them or their family member, in a diabetes study. So as we found, we can find participants quicker, do it in a much more cost-effective way.
Derek, on the money theme that we've been discussing, you've worked with the UN on providing robot participants to international disability conferences. On its face, that sounds expensive, but is it really an expensive proposition compared to some of the alternatives?
Well, that's a great question, Alex. I'd like to circle back really quickly to two of the things that were said earlier, and then I'll jump in there.
Sure.
So one is Julia mentioned some really interesting challenges of laboratory-based science and research. And when we looked early at some of these distributed research models, the idea of a collaboratory is the one that really move people along. The idea of a research facility where people could work together as if they were in the same lab, but could be anywhere in the world. And so William Wolf and the National Science Foundation promoted this idea of building a collaboratory. And some of the most famous of these collaboratories were focused on upper atmospheric research, space physics research, earthquake engineering, marine biology. And so, being able to have access to instrumentation, to colleagues, to, the data in real time, all of those were part of some of these distributed collaborations. And so that was an early part of the idea of a collaboratory. And one other issue I wanted to kind of disagree with a little bit. So early on, there was this focus of trying to replicate being there. And that led to some of these very expensive high-end video conference systems, the idea of virtual reality. We would love the Holoport and so forth and so on. But there was a really famous article in 1992 by Stornetta and Holland called Beyond Being There, which talked about that we shouldn't focus so much on trying to be there, to replicate being there, but think about other things that are critical to our research collaboration. And Julia talked about the notes, those kinds of things, being able to have good audio back and forth, being able to share equipment and share slides and share resources. All of that are critical elements of not just focusing on the high-end video conference. And I think, many of us looked at kind of pushing us down that hole of trying to have just high quality video, virtual reality. And I've done, lots and lots of research comparing these telepresence systems and so forth. And they're very, very powerful, and they make you feel like you're right there. But they also require you to go into the telepresence room as opposed to being able to collaborate wherever you might be. But anyway, going back to this question. So for us, we wanted to take advantage of some of the power that comes from these new technologies, iterations of these technologies like web conferencing. So Zoom, this has gotten the sweet spot of this kind of distributed collaboration. Early on, when we started doing this, it was much choppier and difficult to do this kind of collaboration. But now that you've gotten to this level, you can start to compare what do you get from more telepresence oriented systems compared to these kind of static systems. So as Alex is saying, we did a study where we looked at what distributed collaboration is allowed and afforded by web conferencing compared to telepresence robots. And we did this in a very high profile conference in Mexico on disaster risk reduction, where we had 4 groups of disability advocates around the world connecting to the conference in Mexico via telepresence robots, these kind of an iPad on a Segway you might think about, which can be controlled from anywhere in the world. And then in the study, we compared what was that feeling, how was that engagement with a remote conference compared to just the web conferencing. And the web conferencing gives you this high quality video and audio, but it's in that one room, whereas the telepresence robots can decide, do they want to go from room to room? Do they want to go to the coffee shop area and kind of chat with somebody in a corner? Do they want to go into the exposition area? And in terms of finances and costs, these robots, and obviously the price can go down, but they run about $4,000 a piece. So if you think about that for one conference, you think maybe that's an expensive proposition for that one conference. But if you think about an institution like the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, investing in that infrastructure to have 4 robots that can be used at every single conference, and we were able to take our robots to multiple conferences after that, you start to distribute that cost, over multiple conferences, and the price goes down.
And it's good to keep in mind the purpose of that. It was really an access issue as well, to try to give people who couldn't be at the conference a view of it and some participation in it too. So,
and Alex, what was really interesting at that particular conference, so this is what we call a multi-stakeholder conference. So there was private sector and governments and civil society that were there, but it was the disability community that was using these resources. And so we had people from the private sector saying, could we use your robots to be able to participate? So the disability community was leading, in this area.
Yeah.
Derek brought up can I add something?
Yeah, please jump in.
Brought up a really good point about the fundamental access and equity issues associated with relying on this kind of communication that we're doing right now. And so in my collaborations with researchers in Fiji, the internet quality that they can access is not that good. And so the ability to participate even in these commonplace mechanisms that we now have, we need to work on that before we start thinking about holograms. I couldn't agree more, Derek.
And just one quick comment there, Julia. You're absolutely right, and that was one of the reasons if you focus on systems that require high bandwidth, you're automatically limiting who can participate. And so in the web conferencing wars, there were certainly models of web conference, I won't name them, that focused on, the highest common denominator. Everybody that participated to have a good experience had to have the same level of bandwidth. But many of the other approaches and some of the ones that have won out in this space have said, let's see how much of a good experience we can have, even for people that have lower bandwidth. And those web conferencing platforms have done a lot better than those that focused on the high bandwidth.
Yeah, it seems like there's even a parallel there with some of the mass teaching approaches where sometimes just the text only without video and pictures and stuff that's slower to download, entire courses can be sent to places that have pretty lousy infrastructure and students can access them that way.
I was gonna make a similar point, Alex. I think we've all experienced during the last couple of years kind of Zoom fatigue. And I think another thing to mention is that some of these higher bandwidth options are also, I'm not a psychologist or a neurologist, but they also sort of require more sensory bandwidth. And sometimes, I think we've all had the experience of like, let's not do a Zoom call this time. Let's just pick up the phone, or maybe an email will do, rather than an hour-long Zoom conference. And so I think, it's oftentimes with these remote collaborations, the lower bandwidth options can work. And I think a great example of that in the research area is open source software communities, which, Linux was built long before there was these kinds of technologies that we're using today, using just code versioning systems, which is basically a shared notebook, and internet relay chat, which is basically Slack or something along those lines. And so taking lessons from existing communities that are really good at remote collaboration, I think is one thing that we should be focusing on as we continue to deal with this the challenges of this pandemic.
And if I could just add to that, two things about the Zoom fatigue, Tom. Even within Zoom, there's a feature that I think many people don't know about. So if you go to your video and you go to the hamburger, the three dots, you can say hide self view. And so now you're not seeing yourself in this cognitive load of moving back and forth between you and everybody else. And you can start to have, more interactive conversations without worrying about what you look like at the same time. And then just one comment about open source, and Alex, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but
sure, go for it.
During the pandemic, one of the things that we've helped to focus on is the kind of research that can come, not bench scientists that Julia was talking about earlier, but social scientists, social researchers, to be able to do distributed collaboration using open source software tools like R, and being able to do data analytics and text mining, using R, even teaching people how to use these tools, how to code, in R over long distances. So Ray, we had a project looking at COVID research and how governments were responding to the COVID epidemic, and wanting to make sure or assess the degree to which those government policies included the needs of persons with disabilities. So we had a multi-national research team, multinational data collection, doing the analytics, with commercial and open source tools during this pandemic, to be able to talk about COVID-based research as well, that, I thought was really, really interesting during this period.
Yeah, that's great, Derek. I want to add one comment to your insight is, when we do poster sessions, the context of a poster session for a trainee is very important. It has to feel like a poster session. And we had one that was about 180 posters, 3-hour session, where people, and this was software and proprietary, that could walk from one poster to one poster. You stood in front of it and up came the video, and you could interface, but then as you walked away, you could bump into a colleague and you could discuss. And it felt like a poster session at a national meeting. So I agree, we don't need all the fanciness, but the idea of moving, the idea of triggering a memory of what a poster session was was so impactful. All the trainees came back and said, "My gosh, I loved it. I felt like I was in a poster session," yet everybody was 2D. So I get it, Derek. I think we have to have the context of the interaction be rich. And then it really hits home.
And in those situations, it's not just about exchanging ideas about the content of the research. There's an aspect of career development for the junior researchers. It's absolutely key. And that is something that I think we're still working on in terms of being able to create situations where students who are looking for future jobs, who are looking to grow their career into a new country, to meet people who are strong in their field, can work without actually being there.
And Julia, we had talked about that in a lot of these early collaboratories. And Tom, going back to the FLOSS model, open source software of these concentric circles, with the FLOSS model, you have the core developers in the middle of the circle, and then you have contributors on the outside and then farther, outer concentric circles. And from a collaboratory, Julia, the idea was you've got the core scientists in the middle, but because of these tools, you can think about all the people that are in the session right now that we don't see, that are watching this conversation. And so when you have a research infrastructure that looks like this, you can have people that are legitimate peripheral participators. There's a theory of legitimate peripheral participation where there's a role to play for people who are participating peripherally because they're learning the dynamics and the concepts and so forth, from afar. It's quite fascinating, I have to say.
I think to do this work well, we need to be more deliberate about thinking about what it is we're trying to accomplish with the interaction, and then matching the tools to the need. So for a poster session, we need to think like part of it is about it's about disseminating research, but part of it is about networking. Part of it is about social interaction. What are the needs that we can identify, and which tools do we need to match to those needs? So it's and that I think is, with Sorcery, that's something we're trying to do. That if I know there's a particular document in a particular place, maybe I don't need to fly across the world to get it. However, if I want to spend a long time searching through stacks and shelves that I'm not sure what's there, maybe I do need to fly to that institution. So thinking about the need and matching the technology to the need. In one case, it's an app on your phone. In another case, it's an airplane.
And
one
Alex,
size does not fit all. Yeah.
One quick comment, Alex. I want to go back to something Ray said about the student feeling, or the trainee feeling like they had been in a poster session. And Julia, I want to go back to this. So the telepresence robots that we had in Mexico, I actually walked around the exhibition hall with a person who was driving the robot from the Philippines. And we were going through the exhibition hall, looking at each booth and engaging with the presenters there. And afterwards, the feeling of that person who felt like they were at the conference, as opposed to you watched it on a web conference, was a world of difference.
Thanks. I want to make sure we get to some of our audience questions because there are some really good ones and comments. From Beverly Lindsay, Derek, she identified with some of your problems with pushback early on when you were advocating for some of these, and she wondered what kind of strategies you've used, I guess, either successfully or less successfully, responding to some of those critiques.
And I'll just say very quickly, so the idea for us was, again, meeting substantial pushback, but just to kind of summarize quickly, we identified, my colleague Nanette Levinson and I, this idea of triple track learning, that there had to be learning at the administrative level, at the faculty level, and at the student level, because this was so different at the time. Again, over the last year, people have become more comfortable with this, but you had to have an administrator who was willing to have a faculty member move around to multiple institutions and allow a faculty member who wasn't there to teach a course and be the professor of record for that particular course. For a faculty member who's used to teaching in a certain way, to now say you're going to be teaching students in South Africa while at the same time you're teaching students at 5 other institutions. And then for students, to say, they're willing to take a class where the faculty member is not always going to be there, and they're not always going to be able to see their student teammates, that required a big jump. So learning at each of those levels, and we try to promote that to each of those communities for, you know, university administrators and faculty to take some of these kinds of things on. And now you have, you know, centers for research and teaching and learning that are promoting this kind of virtual collaboration, even before the pandemic. But during the pandemic, those institutions played a critical role at facilitating faculty doing this over distances.
Thank you. I have a question from Stephen for Julia. He asks if you could elaborate on the electronic lab notebook site license experience. Do individual faculty and grad students get access free themselves? Are they being used in teaching labs?
Yeah, so at my university at Georgia Tech, we bought a site license so that any employee or student of Georgia Tech could use the product that we chose. And yes, it's being used in teaching labs as well, but we're still in the pilot phase. So it's been rolled out to a subset of self-identified early adopter, mostly student and teaching assistants, and some faculty. And then we're going to be expanding it more broadly this year. So we're still troubleshooting, but yeah, there's no cost to the individual user since the license is held at the university level. Sort of, kind of, it's a little bit like having you know, access to other kinds of software.
Thanks. I have a question from Peter for Tom. He's asking, and I think, Tom, you touched on this, but he's asking, is asking another student at another institution to share or provide paper legal? So I guess that's where your copyright lawyers or whoever on your team are weighing in, right?
Yeah. So I mean, the legal complexities are numerous. But in general, for materials that are in the public domain, which are many of the things that, for instance, historians and literary scholars need, you know, there are no copyright restrictions. Individual archives will have use policies that we, you know, by our terms of use, that third-party document fulfillers will be bound to follow. So if there are particular restrictions at a particular archive, we make sure that our third-party sorcerers follow those restrictions. You know, these third parties are paid directly. So that's an agreement between the requester and the fulfiller. So you know, this is all, you know, very complex, and we have our lawyers working on it. But in general, yes, the answer is yes. This is all above board and done with the consent of everyone involved.
Thanks. Let me ask, because I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little more about this. You know, it seems like a big potential wrench in all of your projects, and pretty much everything that goes on in university research is hacking and cybersecurity issues. And of course, in the sponsor interview, Bill touched on that. But I'm wondering if any or all of you want to weigh in on, you know, how optimistic or pessimistic you are that could prove kind of an intractable problem.
I could start because PHI, or private health information, is probably one of the highest levels of cybersecurity that's necessary. So at our institution, we're very fastidious about this, even in rolling out decentralized clinical trials. So everyone who is a third party who's working have BAAs, they have to meet very stringent cybersecurity requirements to touch or even access any PHI that can never go anywhere from our clinical research data warehouse. Saying all that, there are sleepless nights, right? Because people do get hacked, electronic medical records. So we're always worried, always vigilant. That's about the best that we can do.
Yeah.
I'll jump in as well. One of my other hats at the university is I'm the faculty co-director of our Internet Governance Lab, and the work we do on cybersecurity is pretty much at the forefront of what I'm spending a lot of my time doing. We gave a talk on Tuesday about Facebook and its challenges this week, you know, with the worldwide outage that they had. So one of the challenges is the weakest link in the cybersecurity system usually is us, the person sitting in the chair that is clicking on a link or opening a file or, doing something that is compromising a fairly robust cybersecurity infrastructure. And we have to guard against that. And so I think in our labs and in our various practices, we have to practice good data hygiene. We have to practice good cybersecurity training so that the individuals who are working in our infrastructure know the dangers of bad practices and know how to guard against them.
I'll say from an academic and scholarly software development perspective, this is the reason why we are searching for revenue models. As I said, like, we're not looking to make any money on this software, but building open source software, building any kind of software is kind of like, owning a house. You're not done once you bought it, right? Like, you're putting money into that thing for the rest of your life. We need revenue to maintain the software, to upgrade security, to install patches, to refactor things when the software ecosystem changes. So that's the sustainability for these kinds of technical systems is a difficult problem, and it's a problem that's ongoing. It's not something you solve once and have solved forever.
Yeah, and finally, I might just say that yes to everything that the three of you have said on that item. When we think about research, the real goal of research is to create new knowledge and disseminate the new knowledge. So there are major cybersecurity issues that have to be accounted for, and at the same time, we have to make sure that we keep doing things that get the research out there so that people can make good use of it.
So in other words, don't let the problem paralyze you, I guess is how I'm translating that. Folks, thank you so much. You have innovating to do, and our hour is up. Let me offer the Chronicle's thanks again to Microsoft for sponsoring this event. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for their insights and their time, to Bill Campman of Microsoft, to the Chronicle's Liz McMillan. A big thank you to our producer, Edwin Davis, and to you, our viewers, for your interest and attention. Today's session was recorded. Watch for that email with the link to the on-demand version in a few days. For the Chronicle, I'm Alexandra Kafka. We have many events, so be sure to keep your eye on our listings, and we will see you next time. Have a good rest of the day.